Hello everyone, very good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. I'm Indu Murthy, Sector Head Climate, Environment and Sustainability. Before we get into setting the context for this webinar and the panel discussion itself, which I'm sure all of you are waiting for, some housekeeping rules to be followed. Please mute yourselves, and of course, Q&A will be at the end of the session. Feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A tab and not the chat box. This has been, of course, disabled for the participants. At the end of the session, participants can raise their hands if they wish to ask the question, and you will be pulled up and you can unmute yourself and ask your question, mentioning to which of the panelists you're actually directing the question. Please keep your questions short and to the point so that we get a lot of discussion going. This workshop is being live streamed on YouTube, and the link is available on all social media handles. COP27 was dubbed as the Adaptation COP and the Implementation COP. COP27 took on an incredibly challenging agenda of loss and damage, adaptation, implementation, and climate finance, all defining issues of our time. While COP27 will go down in the history as the UN climate change conference where loss and damage fund was agreed, it has definitely left open a lot to be reflected upon. For instance, while achieving an agreement on loss and damage fund was a major breakthrough, a watershed moment, a milestone, the nitty-gritties of actually setting up the fund and money flowing in, an agreement on how this finance would be provided and where it should come from still remains. On the adaptation front, at least funding for adaptation, about 40 billion out of the promised 100 billion per year by developed countries by 2020 was reaffirmed, even though it still remains an unfulfilled promise. Despite all the trials and tribulations of being a developing country, India has been making ambitious commitments to climate action and has emerged a global leader in addressing the impacts of climate change. While these are at the global level and at the national level, there is some action definitely happening. It has often been said time and again that climate action begins at home. Now, at this juncture, this action is actually moving from target setting to the implementation phase, rightly so. Take, for instance, the months that went by. We've witnessed multiple climate disasters all around the world and in India as well, be it heat waves, be it floods. And the call to act on climate has never been louder for us. So as the dust settles on the COP, we are here with an esteemed panel to discuss the outcomes of COP27, particularly loss and damage and climate adaptation. Through this discussion, we are hoping to open a dialogue around the outcomes of the COP and its implications, particularly for scaling up adaptation action. I have with me the esteemed panel, who will be introduced by Dr. Anushya, who heads the Adaptation and Risk Analysis Group at CSTEP. And Anushya will also be moderating the discussions. So let's get into the panel discussion without much ado. Over to you, Anu.
A warm welcome to all. I'm delighted to be here. Right now, I'm really very excited to moderate this session. We have very fabulous panel with three experts, Dr. Jayaraman, Ms. Ritu, and Ms. Soumya, have deep knowledge and practice engagements with national and international organizations. Dr. Jayaraman is a senior fellow at MSRF and was associated this for more than a decade. He is a member of Technical Advisory Committee, National Communications to NFCCC, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and also a member of India's delegation to several IPCC sessions and conference of parties of NFCCC. And in the recent COP also has participated. And he was also a member of State Planning Board, Government of Kerala. He works in interdisciplinary perspective in integrating socioeconomic aspects on social science along with natural science and technical aspects of climate change and focuses on equity issues at national and global level. Welcome, sir. Ms. Ritu is a principal researcher at IED, and Ritu has more than 20 years of experience in senior policy development, research and management experience in government funding agencies and international NGOs. She works extensively on loss and damage, climate resilience, resource allocation, conservation, social protection, migration, and gender issues. Her work has helped to evolve robust evidence-based research that has influenced policy framework and strategies for numerous institutions and organizations, including national governments, international development, and humanitarian organization. Ritu also participated in recent COP. Welcome, Ritu. Ms. Soumya is an advisor at Zazer, Delhi. Soumya is a climate change adaptation practitioner and has extensive experience in international development sector with the focus on climate change adaptation, resilience, and gender. She has been working in the helm of science, policy, and practice for climate change in the past 12 years. Her core area of expertise include vulnerability and risk analysis, climate finance, community-based measures, policy formulation, and capacity building for adaptation. Welcome, Soumya. Once again, a warm welcome to all audience. This session has structured in 2 rounds. Each round to be 15 minutes round. And and we will unpack the loss and damage and climate adaptation challenge and its key actors, how India can best formulate the practice. Yeah, now let's directly jump into COP27's big win, that's loss and damage fund. The silent glass of dialogue was streamlined and European Union led first major bloc to concede on developing countries' demand. Really, it's a breakthrough for decade-long conversations of least developed countries, particularly a small island country states and vulnerable states seeking damages from polluting nations. From loss and damage perspective, there are 3 milestones in this COP27. First one is the establishment of dedicated fund for loss and damage, and it has extended the 5-year plan of Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, and it's expanded its cooperation. And third one is the San Diego network has restructured and seeking for the hosts. And yeah, now Professor Jayaraman, can you shed some light on San Diego network? Because parties accepted application of San Diego network at COP27, which is to provide technical assistance on loss and damage to those demand. As important as this, how will this help the developing world access the finance needed for loss and damage or adaptation? And also at what scale this might be?
Now, I don't want to answer, perhaps if you don't mind, at such a technical level, because I think I would like to add a couple of framing issues before I perhaps deal with the very specific question that we have had. One is, I think, with due respect to all concerned, I am beginning to get a real discomfort with the term climate action. I mean, I have used this term myself. It presupposes, it blurs the distinction between mitigation and adaptation. And it puts forward the idea that mitigation and adaptation of the responsibility of all. But then, as the UNFCCC says, it's common but differentiated. And differentiation precisely consists in the fact that those who are responsible for emissions, by and large, are not the people who are responsible, who have the burden of adaptation. So that is, I think, first thing. So I would really like to keep the distinction between mitigation and adaptation. The second point I want to raise is, I think, this campaign that began actually in Madrid, but then intensified before Glasgow. And India, of course, also, in order not to disappoint the world, has gone along with it, is this whole tamasha about net zero. Now, net zero dates in 2050 is like pie in the sky. I mean, it is fine. The whole point is, how are we going to get there? Are we going to get there by staying within the global carbon budget? How is this global carbon budget to be equitably shared? These are the important questions. And to my mind, the greatest damage that is being done by the net zero enthusiasm. It is enthusiasm and action is very thin, as you can imagine, is the damage it is doing to adaptation and loss and damage. Unfortunately, in India, you have everybody and his uncle, if you wish, standing up and promising net zero. The Bihar Pollution Control Board signs a MOU with the Shakti Foundation saying Bihar will be carbon neutral by 2040. Somebody else goes to some other meeting, says we'll be carbon neutral by 2050. Calcutta promises, and can you believe it? This is the city of Kolkata, whose adaptation needs are among the highest among the major metros of the country. They sign on to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I think I am deeply concerned that in the so-called race to net zero, we are forgetting the responsibility of adaptation for a few 100 million people in this country. And this is my foremost concern. And this is a real consequence of the international atmosphere, the aura, the hype that has been built around net zero. And I am sorry to say, aided by the international, the bilateral aid agencies and exacerbated by the international NGO community. So even though we have had this major victory in loss and damage, even though the GGA is the global goal on adaptation is one of the most intense issues of discussion, how much reporting have we seen in the Indian media on this? How much has it reflected in state governments' new climate action plans that are recently being announced? I am sorry to say very little. So that, I think, perhaps is a major challenge before us, and I will not underestimate it. And as far as the negotiations go, I think if we do not build this kind of awareness of adaptation and loss and damage in countries like India, then the way forward is going to be difficult. So coming to the specifics, I'll just, I won't take, I'm going on a bit, but I needed to say the other part. I think we've had a major victory in terms of the agreement on the contours of what is necessary, but achieving it is going to be a challenge. $100 billion has not turned up. That famous pledge, which was made, you remember, in Copenhagen. $100 billion by 2020 started off in Copenhagen. And in its UNFCCC form, it was adapted in Cancun. We have not seen anywhere near the numbers that are necessary. And that too after 17 years of the convention. 13 years later, we've seen only a pittance of part of that money. So is it going to be easy getting L&D money? Not at all. It's going to be an uphill fight. But I think the idea of being responsible...
It's not going to be it'll be a very difficult task only. Yeah,
but I think the focus on responsibility for loss and damage is on board. And the only last point I want to make is, I don't think we should, I hope the several countries in G77 and China will not fall for the temptation of this diversionary argument that it is India and China that should contribute to the fund. Speaking for China, China has a much higher GDP and GDP per capita. China can speak for itself. India, on a voluntary basis, is already doing something quite serious and has shared knowledge in adaptation-related domains with a number of countries of the global south. So I hope this diversionary argument, which came even from some friends in the Asian region at COP27 will not be the future track, and we will get ahead to seeing how we can make this go forward. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, sir. Ritu, this question is posed to you. This reason, World Bank group led by G7, yes, Alexa said G7 and the 20 group of climate vulnerable countries announced a global shield financing facility that aims to provide pre-arranged insurance and disaster protection funding. A step towards financing loss and damage, to be sure, but is there any clarity on how much this will be in grants and how much it will be insured based? Also, what does it mean for India?
Thanks, Dr. Anu. And I'll just quickly, if I'm allowed to take forward some of the points that Dr. Jayaraman raised and then respond to the question that you've raised. Firstly, I agree with him. There's a lot of hype around what loss and damage fund when it was announced at COP27. But there are some good points there as well, which emerged from COP27. And it would be historic in many sense. Firstly, because after 3 decades long of discussion and advocacy, at least they have now accepted that loss and damage is happening. And they have some responsibility towards it. And the announcement of the fund itself is a step in that direction. But yes, there are some issues that Dr. Jayaraman raised. Like, firstly, there has to be a historical responsibility. Like, loss and damage is already happening, and not India and China and other countries, we have not contributed to that loss and damage. And even if we take that path towards 1.5 degree, loss and damage is already happening. We had 2 major floods in Assam last year, in this year itself. This is unprecedented. Media has really created a lot of hype around the floods in Pakistan, yes, which was necessary. But if you look at some of the other countries which have faced similar climatic disasters, the loss and damage there is much, much higher. And even if you look at some of these historical responsibility, just account for the countries like India, we are already paying a lot. Like, even if you look at the kind of resources that India is investing right now in managing its own loss and damage, I'm sure the bill runs into billions of US dollars. We did a small assessment in Bangladesh around this as to how much the households, in absence of climate finance, how much are households and countries already paying for loss and damage. The number ran into billions. So, even if you take aside all that argument around India has to pay, India is already paying. And India is paying for loss and damage, which it is not responsible for. In future, it might be, because we are going on a growth trajectory. But there are 3 points that we really have to notice here. Firstly, countries like India, we have had development deficit. We didn't get a chance to develop as much as the developed countries. And therefore, we do need to take piped water to all our households. We do need to electrify all our villages. We do need to bring all our households and families to a basic level of income. And for that, we need to grow. And if the developed countries have occupied the carbon space, they have to decolonize that carbon space and allow countries like India and others to grow. So that's the historical responsibility. They have to own up to it. The average per capita emission, if you look for developed countries, almost 23 times higher than those of developing countries, some of the developing countries. So how do you account for that? So these are all historical responsibilities. And if you look at India is already footing the bill. So that's one point. Now, coming back to your point around Global Shield and how this fund and how this whole funding mechanism, I have serious concerns, something along the lines of what Dr. Jayaraman mentioned. It's not just about 100 billion being said that we pledge 100 billion, 200 billion for loss and damage in next COP or COP after that. It's about the process in itself. How will these funds actually be delivered to the developing countries? You just look at the Green Climate Fund, which is probably the only named source of climate finance right now, which we have for either adaptation or even for loss and damage. Our assessment shows that a country which is not accredited takes about 5.5 years to get accredited, develop a proposal and get the fund actually approved and get it dispersed. We want similar model for loss and damage, even if the fund is announced, even if it gets resourced, even with 100 billion, will it really reach the countries which really need it in a timely fashion? So for us, that's a big question that we have to address, and we have to see how the global community comes out with the mechanism of delivering this finance. And that again is it's a question of climate justice. It's like, no matter how much they say, India really needs to come out with some good analysis around how much loss and damage fund is it actually contributing already towards managing its own loss and damage. Now, coming down to Global Shield, in my, I know whenever we have talked about loss and damage finance, one thing which is always being thrown on our face is insurance. But when you talk about Global Shield, I would say that it is a bit different. One, because Global Shield is saying that it is going to provide preemptive finance. It's not just going to be post-facto finance. So for me, it does offer a lot of opportunities, especially around, if you just look at some of the social protection programs. Social protection program by far are the only safety net that we offer to communities which are exposed to climate impact, especially around loss and damage. But if we can link some of these, the preparatory actions, some of these preemptive support that we can provide to the community to prepare for some of these loss and damage and other climatic events, this trigger-based insurance mechanism can play a lot of role there. Just to quote an example, in MGNREGS, of course, we'll have to work out feasibility around it. But what we had proposed was within MGNREGS, it provides 100 days of employment under normal condition, but 50 days of additional employment is provided when a drought of a severe category is announced. We are saying that some of this shock responsiveness within these existing social protection programs should be covered through this international climate financing mechanism, like things around Global Shield. And it could be based on reliable early warning system. But once that reliable early warning system says that a drought of a severe category is going to be to set in a particular area, that additional 50 days finance for employment for the finance for that additional 50 days should actually come from some of these insurance mechanisms. And we've seen that index-based insurance mechanisms have worked very well. They offer a good cost-benefit assessment. All we need to figure out is how best we can use some of these insurance mechanisms, which has been announced by the global community, to the best of the developing world.
Ritu, your recent work, on the strengthening anticipatory risk response links the social protections with the Global Shield now. Global Shield and loss and damage. So that how to bring together the finance and insurance community to the social protection.
Yes, that is, so yes, Dr. Anu, thanks for mentioning that recent research that we did. So we have identified 4 ways in which anticipatory response to some of these loss and damage kind of events can be increased. So one, obviously insurance, because Global Shield has opened up a lot of opportunity around it. Second is around debt support, because even during COVID times, we saw that many of these developed countries could finance their social protection, strengthen their social protection program very well. But many of these developing countries, India itself had to take 1 billion loan to strengthen its response under MGNREGS. So some of these debt support should be provided, but triggered on the basis of some of these pre-agreed triggers around, like if pre-agreed thresholds around when a climate goes beyond a certain level, these debt support would be triggered automatically. Third was around using some of these innovative international taxation regime which have been proposed, like even in the initial text around COP27 negotiations around loss and damage, did mention that some of these international levies around fuel subsidy should be provided to the developing world for tackling the loss and damage. And again, we are saying that some of the we are yet to understand how this would be managed, but that again opens up opportunity for us. Barbados Prime Minister, she launched this Bridgetown agenda, And that also offers a lot of opportunity to us around debt support, around some of these international levies. And finally, we could look into resilience bond and some of these voluntary carbon mechanism and so on. But as you mentioned, we do need to bring together the insurance community and the government, and especially work out, see, many of these climatic events, they don't occur in isolation. They occur and they interact with a lot of these other multidimensional risks that we have. We've seen that in the recent Assam floods. We had one event in March, which was unprecedented, then another event in May, June. So we were hardly able to recover from one event and we were pushed into another. So, when you're talking about insurance cover, it has to take into account not just one event, but some of these consecutive and compounding impacts that these events create. And probably work out some of these, come out with comprehensive risk assessment and see what kind of risks are feasible to be covered through insurance and what other kind of risks, considering these multidimensional, consecutive and compounding risks, can be covered through debt support from international community, can be support through other grant-based mechanisms. So not all kind of risks can be covered through insurance, but yes, opening this global shield has definitely, especially them mentioning that we are willing to provide preemptive finance, does provide us some opportunity to deal with it. But yes, we also have to be mindful that not all kind of risks would be covered through insurance.
Thank you, Ritu. Thank you so much for your detailed explanation. And Soumya, do you think there is a need to make a separation between developing countries like India, China, and Bangladesh and the small island nations with regard to the funding arrangements under LND? To play devil's advocate, can one say developing countries of the like of India and China are poised to become the next superpowers, and hence, can we find a way to finance our own damages?
Thank you, Dr. Anu, for that question. I think Dr. Jayaraman and Ritu have already touched upon these points and further. But I will just try to add to it. I think the setting up of an international fund on loss and damage is, the underlying value or the core principle of such a fund has to be polluter pays, and which ultimately is about taking responsibility for historical emissions, but also liability for compensating the loss and damages that are happening in developing nations around the world. And having said that, I think it's ironical that countries like India, Bangladesh, and China would be separated from, or there would be a distinction between countries like India and other small island developing nations purely on the basis of development index, because it undermines the core principle of such a loss and damage fund, which is supposed to be funded by a global community, which has historical responsibility and liability to pay for certain losses and damages. And especially for a country like India, I think a lot of course, we know that it is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and we still need a lot of investment, both in terms of financial investment and technological investment, to not just bring millions out of poverty, but also ensuring food security at the same time, achieving developmental goals, and doing this while transitioning to a cleaner energy source. So while India and maybe Bangladesh and China are becoming or will become next superpowers, this historical loss and damage, which is already happening, has to be paid through a very clear and transparent mechanism, which I hope that the transitional committee comes out with a clear roadmap by the next COP. And I think secondly, because I remember that United States also had a very conditioned sort of acceptability to this loss and damage fund. They try to avoid the term liability and compensation altogether. And the developed countries are also facing climate extremes. So with this distinction, they might want to prioritize addressing loss and damage in their own countries first, rather than giving money to countries like India, which as per whatever the discussion was happening, are able to provide for their own loss and damage. So I think having said that, this distinction does not make sense. It undermines the core principle. What would be more logical is to develop a certain set of criteria based on not just the climate risk and the climate vulnerability, but also a magnitude of impacts, both economic and non-economic, which the developing nations are already facing, are projected to face. And based on that, the funds can be channelized when this mechanism is set up. Thank you.
Yeah, at this point, I like to hear from you that any standard definitions and methodologies available to access L&D?
Standard methodology.
Yeah, definitions and methodologies.
So as per my knowledge, there are several definitions for loss and damage and also methodologies to assess loss and damages, purely because the nature of impacts is cross-sectoral and it's also compounding in nature. It goes across sectors, across regions. We have done certain climate risk assessments using L&D as a part of a comprehensive climate risk management cycle. So while trying to finalize options for addressing loss and damage as part of a broader climate risk management cycle. But a standard methodology for assessing loss and damage, to my knowledge, is not available. But then we have lots of lessons from both the DRR and the CCA communities methodologies for assessing economic. And also more challenging is the non-economic part of the overall loss and damage assessments. And also the loss and damage from the slow onset events, because a lot of focus is given on extreme weather events, rainfalls, floods, cyclones. But I think in this debate, somehow the slow onset events are somehow missing, which are equally important because it can also enhance the impact of an extreme weather event, but in isolation as well cause a lot of impacts to livelihoods, to communities, to different sectors for a developing nation like India.
Okay, your CCRI work, you have done some work in Himachal and Tamil Nadu, isn't it? That involves the climate risk management framework to assess L&D. Can you shed some light on this? What are the outcomes and how risk management options of CCRI?
Sure. So the climate risk management work, which basically is not a prescriptive guidance, but more of a context-specific guidance, a 6-step approach, which can be applied to any geography, any scale, based upon the information requirements and needs of a particular stakeholder group. We did it, piloted the approach in 2 states of India, Tamil Nadu and Himachal Pradesh, essentially to understand what the climate risks are in 2 villages in both these states, combining a more top-down approach followed by a more bottom-up approach and participatory analysis with the communities. And the interesting part of this approach was that we tried to evaluate risk tolerance levels. So for example, going with stakeholder discussions, expert judgment, n number of risks came up while discussing with different experts, also through climate risk and vulnerability maps, also historical data on loss and damages, which have, for example, incurred in the infrastructure sector. So what makes a risk intolerable, acceptable, or tolerable for a community? That has certain bearing on, of course, loss and damage, but also on devising suitable adaptation and risk management options. So based on whether a risk is acceptable to the communities, an incremental risk management or adaptation option might suffice. If a risk is not acceptable, we would need a more fundamental option. And if it's completely intolerable, for example, the community is already facing series of flash floods, the projections tell that the rainfall patterns are going to make extreme weather events more and more frequent, then we would need a more transformative adaptation action or a risk management option comprising of various actions, right from early warning system to a complete overhaul maybe of the integrated water management of that area, the infrastructure zoning, the land use zoning. So that kind of matchmaking has to be done, combining with what is happening at the ground, what the projections tell us, and how we can identify a basket of options that can support both incremental, fundamental, and transformative adaptation options. There were some learnings as well from that assessment. Firstly, being that while economic loss and damage is generally simpler, I would say, to assess because there is sometimes data available on, let's say, mortality rate or what kind of infrastructure damage happened. But a non-economic loss and damage, which is equally important, can sometimes become challenging to assess. Like non-economic can mean issues related to health, which are not quantified, issues related to mental health in some region, which are not quantified, or general livelihood loss for which we don't have authentic data available. Similarly, because climate risk management is also looking at not only short and medium term, but also longer term projections and devising appropriate action. So while we can assess certain population trends and certain economic trends to project what it will look like in the future, like what kind of economic development a particular village is projected towards. But how will it really interplay with the climate projections or hazards, and how will it change exposure levels or vulnerability of that particular community is sometimes difficult. And for example, extreme weather event, like, like the floods that we have been seeing in the past years, can completely alter the developmental trajectory of a village or of any region for that matter, and which was being devised. So this is challenging. It still needs to be addressed with more research on the ground, more research within the scientific community, how to make it risk-proof for the future. I will end there.
Thank you, Soumya. Thank you so much. Dr. Jayaraman, here I want to pose a question to you. Like Soumya said, the current adaptation actions are making a difference, but most of essentially the immediate and near-term risk. So in countries like India, the lack of climate financing also means the adaptation is implemented as isolated and pilot projects. This uneven coverage is leading to the adaptation gaps where transformation action is needed. How do you think we can address this issue with the depth of external funding of adaptation?
I think this is a good question. It also enables me to take on board a question which is there in the Q&A box on the distinction between development funding and climate sensitive development, and some points which Soumya is making. So let me put it all together in one package answer. One is, I completely disagree. I agree with the problem that is posed by the person, Anirudh, I think, in the Q&A box, that asking what is the difference between traditionally funded development and climate sensitive development. So I think the solution, I agree with the question, but the solution that he recommends that the two must be merged together, I'm completely not in consonance with it. So a lot of the description that Soumya gave of work, etc., is simply the failure of routine disaster management. And for instance, drought sensitivity on the scale that we see in, say, US agriculture is not present in third world agriculture. This is simply a fact. The extent to which rescue and relief operations are available in many developed countries, and the level of comfort and well-being that they provide to evacuees are no comparison to the conditions under which we evacuate people. And this is simply a function not of the intensity of the hazard, not of the frequency of the hazard, but simply about the amount of money we have. We are very proud of the fact that we can evacuate 100,000 people at 2 days' notice, and we put them, however, in schools and converted marriage halls, etc., under conditions which are extremely challenging for the people involved. This is not what happens in the United States or Europe. So let's not fool ourselves. All development is not climate sensitive development. A lot of what we are feeling is our development deficit. And I must say, this whole point about everything being climate is quite counterproductive. In agriculture, I have an excellent example. There is this general idea that all agricultural challenges of climate extremes in agriculture are climate change due to increased global warming, and that's simply not true. And we have, for instance, extensive yield gaps in crop production, and that's you can grow at some productivity in other parts of the world. We are not able to reach it in India. Odisha cannot do as well as Punjab or Haryana. Tamil Nadu does not do as well as Maharashtra, maybe. All of this is because of development deficits, and the term still makes sense. So that is one part of it. And the whole problem about insurance is precisely in this respect. And I think Ritu touched on it, but I would like to really emphasize catastrophic damage, large-scale damage is simply cannot be dealt with by insurance. The first example go back as far back as the 1930s in the United States, where catastrophic failures like drought, etc., particularly a very good example. Flooding on the scale we saw in Pakistan is another example. Even when there is no global warming as such in a certain sense, these cannot be dealt with by insurance. So adaptation, as IPCC says very clearly in Working Group 2, and it has been reinforced in the Sharm el-Sheikh decision, is a matter of public finance and state support. Okay, and this insurance is not the way this is going to get done. So this, I think, is very important. But it is not the distinction between the impact of global warming and development deficits is not simply a matter of time scale, short term versus long term. That is one way to think about it. But it is also the fact that there is a thing we can isolate called development deficits. There is the additionality, which is due to global warming. And that distinction, I believe, does exist. Unfortunately, the tendency in the global community has been to dilute this difference. And in the somewhat misplaced argument, I feel that this makes the case for loss and damage or adaptation stronger. I think it has been not in our favor. So we must return to more careful attribution. When we talk about loss and damage, we must be more careful about what is in it. In fact, the IPCC is very clear again about it in Working Group 2. It says very clearly that in the reduction of vulnerability in the short and medium term, it is not the differences in emission scenarios that are the chief factor, but the reduction of the socio-economic causes of vulnerability. This is very clearly stated in SPM Working Group 2, the summary for policymakers. So it is in this context, I think, that we should think about this issue. Time scale is only part of the story. It's only the superficial aspect, but content of what is it that we set out to do must be really face up to what is development deficits and what is actually adaptation. Thank you.
Rightly you said development deficits are there, but still the global warming is more fire on development deficits, making more complex. That's the problem here. And that's what we are looking more into adaptation.
No, but I think, for instance, I think there are cases. Here's a simple example. And this is where climate resilience becomes a confusing story. So, for instance, you want to buy boats for disaster relief. Everybody needs boats for disaster relief. Are you going to insist that all the boats be solar powered? Because if you have diesel engine boats, they will add to emissions. This is suppose you put out a fleet of ambulances and you put out a fleet of firefighting equipment. Are you going to insist that they are all electrically powered? Are we going to say that it's all right? It can be diesel powered. These happen. So I think climate resilience creates one set of conclusions on this. But for instance, let us take, for instance, in the case of drought. Actually, if you look at heat wave mortality, you see that heat wave mortality in India has been on the decline from the peak of 2015. Now, if you want to make a point about it, you can say, yes, very good. We have, done successful adaptation to heat waves, but I think that would be fooling ourselves. What we have done is to fill the development deficit in terms of how our country is prepared for heat waves. And adaptation is still a challenge for the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Ritu, in this point, what do you think? What is the role of risk mapping of different scales in executing successful adaptation projects?
Can you just repeat it again, Anu?
What do you think in the role of risk mapping of different scales in executing successful adaptation projects?
Yes, so risk mapping is extremely essential, Anu, but then the point is, because as Dr. Jaraman was saying, the lines are so blurred between right now. So between development, what do we account as development? What do we really account as climate impact and so on? So probably, something that we are ourselves facing a lot of challenge around what framework do we really provide to the, like if you go to a household at a village level, for them, they really don't care about whether it's climate impact or development impact or any other source of impact, whether it's health impact because of COVID and so on. For them, what they want is, no matter what the shock is, whether it's because of COVID, whether it's because of climate or any other like economic shock as well for them, they should be able to prepare, cope, and recover from that shock. And for that, what we are saying is we typically need, like, keep aside all of these other discussions, keep aside the politics around loss and damage, or keep the politics aside on development and everything else. We need to really do a multidimensional risk assessment at the community level. And this risk assessment should incorporate all kinds of crisis or a risk a household can face. It could be because of livelihood damage, that could be because of economic reasons, because market failures, because of climate impacts, because of a poor infrastructure. Probably that village does not have a well-connected road to take their produce to the market. So, take all those impacts, take all those risks into consideration, do a proper multidimensional risk assessment, and then also account for the climate impact, the kind of risk that climate impact would create, the stress multiplier impact that it would create on that multidimensional risk that a community is already facing. So if there are floods happening, if the frequency of flood is going to increase, if that area is drought prone, and if the drought intensity might increase, like if it used to happen once in 2 years or 3 years, now it's happening every year. So what that impact means for that multidimensional risk assessment that you've done at the local level, and then account for that. So for a household at that level, because Dr. Jaraman put it very well around development deficit, it is these communities are facing. So you need a certain development action around that to bring that family above a certain level, above, like we used to call, now even Niti Aayog defines it as multidimensional poverty. So look at those multidimensional risks. What is it that we really need to bring that household above a certain vulnerability threshold? And then look at how climate is acting as a stress multiplier, pushing those families back below that multidimensional risk threshold. And then develop shock responsive, like responsive, either social protection or other mechanism by which you can help those families cope and recover from them. But having said that, because the lines between development and adaptation is blurred to such an extent, like even within MGNREGS, a program that we work very closely with Ministry of Rural Development, we are saying that MGNREGS, even in its current form, even without doing any intervention with it, because it provides 100 days of guaranteed wage employment, because it creates soil and moisture conservation activity, because it does land development work, it is automatically leading to some sort of adaptation. Although in not every area that land development, soil conservation, moisture conservation is done on a landscape basis, but if we add a layer of climate information into it, if we do a proper geographic GIS-based planning around it, then the same investment can lead to adaptation benefits. The same investment can help families because of that 100 days of employment cope, because of that wage employment. Tashina was part of some of the research that we did previously on MREX. Just by providing that 100 days of employment, they are helping households cope. They're able to maintain their consumption level. So it is, like, even if it is a development intervention, it is helping communities cope. Then if you do that investment properly, if you're doing a landscape-based treatment with the same investment, it can help in taking some of those areas towards permanent, from water crisis towards permanent drought proofing. But you do need to make some additional investments there to make those investments, like make those existing development intervention more climate resilient. So I'll just stop there. But yes, when you talk about, I digressed a little, but when you're talking about climate risk management at the local level, probably almost every development intervention has a need to include a climate risk, multidimensional risk assessment, and then look into climatic risk factor or shocks that it can create on those investments.
Thank you, Ritu. Like you said, the adaptation needs to be transformative. Yeah, and it should be integrated with the development actions. Thank you so much. And yeah, now it's time for, time is running out. From the audience, is there any questions? Maybe. Is there any questions from the audience?
So I think I'll come in. I mean, I'm at CSTEP, but I just had a question on, I think some of the panelists did actually touch upon these parts of these of this question earlier, but I just wanted to understand, with the urgency of climate change, with impacts happening at an expedited rate, there is this tendency to further be non-democratic in your processes of adaptation, where you become more, the process become more top-down, where you tell the villages how to cope or adapt to a certain intervention, because there is this urgency with climate impacts. And democratic processes are also very, very energy intensive, resource intensive, time intensive, but it has to be done that way. But there is a tendency to not do it that way because of the sort of timelines that we're looking at. So how do we actually make these adaptation processes more democratic in nature? And I'd like to, I think I can open this out to whoever would like to respond. But yeah. Yes, Ritu ma'am, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just quickly respond to it, and Dr. Jayaraman, you can come in later. One thing that we have experienced from our own work and project is, what you really need to do is not knee-jerk reaction when a crisis occurs, but rather prepare for it in advance. And the one way in which we can do is probably make some of our, for example, social protection program more shock responsive, so that not every time you have to come in with a humanitarian response, which is, like, as you said, non-democratic in nature. If you look at the way India responded to the COVID crisis, we already had NGNREGIS, a program which was already functioning, and which is, in many sense, it's community-driven, it's rights-based and everything. All that India needed to do was increase the resources or budget allocation within those programs. Not to say that even that delivery was without challenges, but as long as you have an existing framework through which you can route, through which you can deliver some of these shock responsive investments, I think we always don't need to make it non-democratic, because if you have systems, you have strengthened those systems by which you can deliver humanitarian or other responses, it works well even in crisis.
Right. Thank you so much. Do you have something else to add? I'm sorry, I felt like I cut you off. If not, Dr. Jayaraman can just continue again.
Actually, that's an interesting point because I think that speaks to another point I was intending to raise, which was sort of bothering me. There was this constant refrain in various speakers and comments about communities and how communities may need social protection nets, communities may need infrastructure. But there are many things which communities, as communities, simply cannot do, especially if they are a country of the global south. There's a whole point about there being countries of the global south. And the point is, I think adaptation action, as also loss and damage, is a multi-scalar problem. So there are decisions, properly speaking, if you want to say infrastructure building, properly speaking, part of the decision making is at a top level, if you wish, at the level of the nation state, at the level of a government, at the level of, and when we talk of climate finance, it is really countries that must negotiate with entities like GCEF, etc., for projects and funding. Then there are intermediate levels of governance which have their own role to play, and there is also the community. So I think it is at the end of the day, governance will work here in the context of adaptation and damage, just as governance works in any other case. So if you don't want the employment problem to be livelihoods to be dealt with, if you want to deal with it in a democratic fashion, instead of imposing top-down solutions, that's just the same as what we would need in climate. So I think to that extent, climate governance is not something new and sort of unseen before that drops from the skies on us. It is very much how we govern ourselves, and all the things we successfully do and all the things we fail at in governance as we know it will also affect what we do in climate. So I think it's not an independent question, but just to underline that adaptation and loss and damage is multi-scalar. All scales are important up to the level of the global. Otherwise, we'd have no discussion at the UNFCCC on adaptation and loss and damage to start with, in some sense. And so, that would be my take on it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jayaraman. I'm going to pass it on to Tashina. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time, and Tashina will just wrap up today's event.
Yeah. Sorry, we're completely out of time. Like Sahil said, if you have any other questions, participants, we will make sure to respond to you directly. We touched upon a lot of things today during this discussion, but one thing that came up very strongly was that the common but differentiated responsibilities is even more important today. We are already footing the bill for L&D and in our own countries, and there is a need to quantify this. But what is most important is the need for the developed world to decolonize the global carbon space and allow us to grow to attain just basic development. We also touched upon the need for multidimensional risk assessments at community level for transformational adaptation and integrate this with development. I will not get into more of the topics that we touched upon. I would like to sincerely thank our panelists, Ritu, Soumya, and Dr. T. Jayaraman. Thank you so much for joining us and for this wonderful discussion. It really does help us put things into perspective, and it opens up so many opportunities for learning and ideation around adaptation and scale to help inform India's policy direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you. Bye-bye.